you see in this photo?
Myself, some of the hospital staff.
And it was after you made these observations that you spoke with Lieutenant Matson?
Yes.
Did you attempt then, after your conversation with Lieutenant Matson, to gather more information from the defendant and Officer Tao?
I did. I think he requested me to ask them if they'd used any other force.
And did you have that conversation with the defendant?
I did.
Do you recall what the defendant told you?
I believe he said he knelt on Floyd or knelt on his neck, something of that nature. I don't recall his exact words.
And is that the first time you became aware that force had been applied to Mr. Floyd's neck?
Yes.
Did the defendant tell you?
Probably, he did not want to say that the kneeling of his neck was illegal, not by procedure or cop rules or pig rules, but just by overall statute of he was already detained and was unable to fight. Nearly 10 minutes his neck was kneeled on from behind, and ultimately resolved in his death. This guy did not want to say that, but he had to. Of course, he resigned before this trial.
Yes, it was deemed a critical incident then.
What is a critical incident?
And this happened on his shift, as his time, if you will, on his time, if you will.
Where somebody shot and killed by police, things of that nature.
And what are your responsibilities then, as the shift sergeant, when a critical incident happens in an area over which you have supervisory authority?
It needs to be roped off with police tape and evidence preserved. Body-worn cameras, make sure they're turned back on.
What has to be done with the people who were involved in the critical incident?
They need to be kept separate and eventually transported down to the courthouse.
And in this case, did you take specific steps that were consistent with the critical incident response?
I did.
What did you do?
I got a hold of Sergeant John Edwards, who was the overnight
This Dove has already admitted that
asked him to head down to 38th
his former co-worker
and then
under his tenure was wrong for having his knee behind George Floyd's neck, whether it was a legal technique or not. He's already admitted it was done too long, and it was unnecessary after he was already restrained. So literally after he said you were killing him, and he urinated on himself and things of that nature, he's already admitted to that.
Yes.
For anybody who's looking at this video.
You were able to secure transport officers or rides for officers Lane?
He hated to say it.
I'm
gonna get that down too. If they when they recap it.
Tom and Shelvin.
If I have time.
I found somebody to have figured out.
Can you describe your?
He hated to answer yes. He stumbled and nearly stuttered to say yes. It was way too long, and it was unnecessary for him to kneel his knee, gouge his knee in the back of that man's neck like that.
Rooms in the city hall where the officers are going to gather to be interviewed and stuff after the critical incident.
What did you then proceed to room 108?
I did.
And what did you do after you proceeded to room 108?
I mostly just waited till the officers were interviewed and eventually headed back to the 3rd Precinct station.
Did you have any further interaction with the defendant at room 108, or did the other administrative personnel take charge?
Pretty much the other administrative personnel.
After then directing Edwards to secure the scene, making sure that the officers reported as they were supposed to, did you at some point gather some additional evidence associated with this case?
I did.
When was that?
I was back at the 3rd Precinct and I believe Officer Lane approached me and had forgotten some information in his pocket, some witness information that he'd taken from somebody in the vehicle, and turned that over to me, which I turned over to another officer to be property inventoried.
And after inventorying that information or that material, did you have any other involvement in the case?
I wrote a short report on turning that information over, and that was it for the night.
Okay. And when did your shift end that night?
Officer's force against Floyd should have ended as soon as they put him in on the ground, and which he wanted and requested to be put on the ground.
Associated with this case. Is that
Don't
right?
look good for the defense.
And as the supervisory shift sergeant,
Does not look good, but you know how y'all do. You know how you are,
is that right?
reprobates.
Yes.
And to clarify your testimony from earlier, the restraint of an individual on the ground is a form of force, correct?
Yes.
And restraining someone on the ground handcuffed, that's considered to be the prone position, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that a person may be restrained only to the degree necessary to keep them under control,
Yes.
and no more restraint?
Right.
Based upon your review of this incident, do you believe that the restraint should have ended at some point in the encounter?
Grounds?
Right there in sidebar, and this is key testimony here talking about the force used. Was it excessive use of force? What David Pfluger's testified earlier is that, yes, you can use this maximal restraint technique, but once you have control of the suspect, in this case it's George Floyd,
Like when they tell you they're dying.
it should not last 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I mean, Joey Jackson's with us, and Joey,
31 seconds from being 10
I
minutes.
apologize ahead of time. I have to interrupt if we get back to court, but that's huge, isn't it?
31 seconds, excuse me, 31 seconds, 31 ticks of being 10 minutes.
Hear every indication that this sergeant is laying out some of the protocols of the department, what's acceptable, what is not acceptable, what you can do. And what you can do is you use force, you get the subject under control, and then you relent. To the extent that you don't do that, it's unreasonable. To the extent that it's unreasonable, it's unlawful. To the extent that it's unlawful, you're convicted. So that's why they're at sidebar.
Bye-bye.
Such an important
Bye-bye now.
Yeah, I mean, from what it's saying,
Reprobate.
once you have George Floyd